Lots to unpack from Sam's package there, but lots as well to discuss with the government as a whole. Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, is here with me. Delighted to welcome you to the show. Good morning, Minister.
Good to be here.
Let's get a quick comment, if we can, on the inflation data, first of all. So this is disappointing, hotter than expected.
It is disappointing. These are disappointing figures. I know from people in my own constituency as well as elsewhere how difficult the cost of living crisis is for people. But no one said we could fix the entire economy overnight. We brought it down from the double-digit inflation that we used to see under the previous government. But if
it was 2.1 when you took over.
But the whole economy was unstable, and we're having to stabilise the economy. I think if you take things in the round...
Just to clarify that, inflation is higher than when you took over.
But it was very unstable under the previous government. It wasn't in a particular trajectory. It was going up and down quite wildly. In many, many ways, those were problems with the economy. If you look in the round at the situation we've got now, we've seen interest rates come down now for 4 months in a row. We've seen an increase in the national minimum wage, putting £1,400 back in the pockets of some of the lowest paid workers in the country. And just this first quarter of this year, this country has the fastest growth of any economy in the G7, the biggest economies in the world. So no one said everything was going to be fixed overnight, but this is an economy that is on the road to recovery.
I wanted to get your views on Israel-Gaza. We all kind of watched it in Parliament yesterday and saw the Foreign Secretary outlining the point of view. I guess my first big picture question on this is, have we crossed the line now where the government here has a altogether different perspective of the Israeli government than perhaps at any point in the last few years?
Well, we've all seen what's going on in Gaza on our screens. We think the situation now is intolerable. The Netanyahu government is making things worse, not making things better. We want an immediate ceasefire. That means the renewed hostilities by Israel need to stop. We then need to see the release of the hostages who are being held, the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas, need to be released. We can then get unimpeded aid into Gaza to support those people, an international programme to rebuild Gaza and from the devastation it's in. But in the long term, the only peace between Israel and Palestine comes from a two-state solution with a secure Israel, safe within their borders, alongside a free and independent Palestine. And we're working with our allies, the French and the Canadians, as you saw yesterday, to put pressure on the Netanyahu government to start making things better and stop making the situation even worse.
But that's really lots to unpack there. I mean, interesting that you list France and Canada. This latest step, what we saw yesterday, some sanctions on some West Bank settlers, talk of sanctions on other government ministers, that's a UK-only move, not in tandem with France and Canada, like the statement a couple of days ago?
We're working closely with our allies, and there are other allies as well who are trying to apply pressure on the Netanyahu government. Nobody in the world wants to see the scenes that we're seeing at the moment from Gaza. The threat of widespread famine is simply unacceptable. This has gone beyond just self-defence on the part of Israel. This is an attack that we can no longer tolerate. So we are looking at what steps we can take as a UK government in concert with our allies to encourage Israel to stop the hostilities, get round the negotiating table and bring this situation, this crisis, to a close.
You said the Netanyahu government has made things worse, not better. Are you considering sanctions on Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, we've announced the sanctions that we're going to apply. I'm not going to sit here and speculate on what more we need to do. I hope what we've announced already will be enough. Let's see what happens now. But this government is going to do what we need to do to encourage the Netanyahu government in Israel to stop these renewed hostilities, allow aid into Gaza and encourage the release of those hostages.
Today you're announcing various investigations into water companies. Talk us through the details.
Well, the public, as you'll know, are absolutely furious about the state of our waterways. We saw record levels of sewage in our rivers, lakes and seas just last year. Today, I can announce that we have a record number of criminal investigations underway into water companies, 81 of them. That's the biggest set of legal criminal action against water companies in history, with maximum sanctions now of 5 years in prison for those who are offending. The era where the water companies got away with polluting our waterways is over. We are going to take what action is necessary to ensure that our rivers, lakes and seas are restored to the cleanliness that people remember from when they were younger.
What is the bar for somebody, an individual, a boss, to go to jail? I mean, the legislation obviously on this has changed recently.
Yeah.
Does that allow retrospective investigations into sewage being dumped years ago, or is it really since the legislation passed?
Yeah, well, legislation isn't retrospective. Legislation applies from the point that the legislation is passed. Otherwise, you get into a very tangled legal situation. But I fully recognise the law and regulation was too weak under the previous government, and that is why the water companies got away with doing what they did to our rivers, lakes and seas. No kid should, no parent should watch their kid going to splash around in the waves on a beach and worry whether the water is contaminated. We want to get back to a position where the water is clean. It's not just through legislation and the law that we're doing this. We've secured over £104 billion of private sector investment over the next 5 years that will reduce sewage pollution by nearly a half. In that time frame. This is a dramatic change in what we had before, but we want to focus the minds of those who are running the water companies. Their job is to clean up our rivers, lakes and seas from pollution, not to profit from doing more of it.
I wanted to ask about the UK-EU deal. Clearly, now we'll be able to export foods to the EU without the scale of checks that came previously. Understandably, that comes with an alignment on food standards only in terms of regulation and rules around food. Talk me through the process to get to that point. It takes a bit longer than people might expect. We have to pass legislation domestically that kind of catches us up to the EU regulations that may have gone away in the last 8 years? Yeah,
well, the deal will need to go through Parliament in the usual processes, and my colleagues will know the detail of that far better than I will. But the problem we're trying to fix with this, particularly if you look at the food and drink sector, since you raised that, exports from the UK into the EU of food and drink have declined by 21%, that's over a fifth since 2018. That is vast amounts of money out of our economy, jobs being lost, businesses closing down. By removing those barriers to trade, we can get those exports moving across the border again. I've spoken to supermarket bosses who tell me that the lorries have to wait so long for checks that the food rots at the border. That is having a huge impact on prices. The Prime Minister was in Lidl yesterday talking to shoppers and people working in the supermarkets. This is going to help with food price inflation, because if the food isn't rotting, it's on the shelves being sold, that's better for the consumers, it's better for the businesses.
But we have to pass legislation to match EU regulations in this area?
Well, the whole deal will go through Parliament, then it will be enacted.
But if our regulations aren't the same as the EU's, they'll have to match them?
Well, on the whole, our regulations are already the same, actually. We haven't changed them. It was just that there had to be checks because of the nature of the deal that the previous government agreed. So in most cases, we already align, which makes the situation even more unacceptable, because our produce is being blocked from entering the EU, businesses closing down, simply because the Conservative government raised those barriers to trade at the borders.
Final question. I've got Sharon Graham coming on in a couple of minutes' time to talk about the bin strikes in Birmingham. This morning, Unite is saying that Labour, the central government, not the council, is blocking a deal, and that the negotiations have been a shambles with the government at the heart of it. What's your message to her? She comes on in just a few minutes.
That's such a nonsense. I think Sharon Graham and Unite need to stop playing politics with people's lives, call off this strike. They've got a perfectly acceptable deal that's been on the table for quite some time now. The government has been supporting Birmingham City Council in getting people in to clean up the worst of what has been left on the streets. But we want this strike resolved. We want Unite to call it off.
Thanks so much for joining us, Steve Reed, this morning, the Environment Secretary, and we'll get, of course, Sharon Graham's response shortly. For now, Steve Reed, thanks so much.